In the early 1970s, across several American states, a young man moved through society without raising suspicion. His name was Ted Bundy. To anyone who met him, he seemed intelligent, polite, and even charming. He studied law, volunteered in political campaigns, and maintained relationships that appeared completely normal. There was nothing about him that suggested danger. In fact, he seemed like the kind of person you would trust instantly. But that appearance was carefully crafted. In 1974, young women began disappearing in Washington. College campuses, which were supposed to be safe spaces filled with ambition and youth, slowly became places of fear. At first, the disappearances seemed unrelated. A student failed to return home. Another vanished after leaving a campus event. Some were last seen walking alone at night. There were no signs of forced entry, no clear suspects, and no immediate evidence connecting the cases. Families were devastated. Parents waited for calls that never came. Friends organized searches that led nowhere. Law enforcement treated each case as isolated, unaware that a single predator was responsible. Ted Bundy had discovered something powerful. People naturally trust someone who appears confident and harmless. He exploited this instinct with precision. Often, he pretended to be injured. He wore a fake cast or used crutches to appear weak. He approached women in public places and politely asked for help carrying books or loading items into his car. His tone was calm, friendly, and convincing. Most people never hesitate to help someone who looks vulnerable, and that hesitation cost lives. Witnesses later recalled meeting a polite man named Ted. He was articulate and well-spoken. Nothing about the interaction seemed threatening at the time. But those brief encounters were often the last moments victims were seen alive. As weeks turned into months, authorities began noticing similarities between the cases. The descriptions matched. A tall, attractive man, brown hair, confident demeanor. The name Ted surfaced more than once. Still, there wasn't enough evidence to make an arrest. Meanwhile, Bundy grew bolder. He was not acting out of impulse. He was studying his surroundings, adjusting his methods, and learning from each crime. He understood how investigations worked. He understood how people thought. And most dangerously, he understood how to blend in. To the outside world, he continued living what looked like a normal life. He dated. He socialized. He attended classes. No one could imagine that beneath the surface lived someone capable of calculated brutality. The fear spreading across Washington was quiet but real. Women began traveling in groups. Parents warned their daughters. Campuses increased security. Yet the predator remained invisible. By the end of 1974, multiple lives had been taken, though the full extent was still unknown. Law enforcement agencies were overwhelmed, working without modern forensic technology or national databases. Communication between states was limited, allowing Bundy to move freely without detection. The man who appeared so ordinary was hiding something monstrous. And this was only the beginning. By early 1975, the disappearances in Washington had slowed. To the public, it almost felt like relief. But investigators were uneasy. Serial predators rarely stop without reason. When patterns suddenly break, it often means only one thing: the danger has moved. Ted Bundy understood risk. He followed news reports. He sensed growing pressure from law enforcement. Staying in one state for too long increased the chances of recognition. Witness sketches were circulating. Survivors had started describing a charming man named Ted. The net was tightening, even if slowly. So he adapted. Bundy relocated to Utah and enrolled in law school. Once again, he slipped into routine life with disturbing ease. He attended lectures, participated in discussions, and spoke confidently about legal theory. But beneath that composed exterior, nothing had changed. Within months of his arrival, young women in Utah began disappearing. College towns that once felt secure were suddenly clouded with fear. Victims vanished from parking lots, sidewalks, and university areas. Just like in Washington, there were no signs of forced entry, no loud confrontations, no obvious witnesses. The pattern was chillingly familiar. Survivors who managed to escape described the same type of man: polite, articulate, well-dressed. He sometimes pretended to be injured, wearing a sling or cast, asking for assistance with something simple. A small favor, a moment of kindness. That was all it took. Bundy had refined his approach. He selected locations carefully. He observed routines. He learned which environments offered the least resistance. However, law enforcement was no longer operating in isolation. Detectives in different states had started communicating more actively. Reports from Washington were compared with cases in Utah and neighboring regions. Descriptions aligned. Methods overlapped. Even the name Ted surfaced again. For the first time, investigators began considering the possibility of a single offender operating across state lines. Bundy was no longer invisible, but he still wasn't caught. On the night of August 16, 1975, a routine patrol officer in Utah noticed something unusual. A tan Volkswagen Beetle was parked late at night in a residential area. The driver's behavior appeared suspicious. When the officer approached, Bundy seemed nervous but cooperative. His calm demeanor was still intact, but something felt off. The officer decided to search the vehicle. Inside, he discovered items that raised immediate concern: handcuffs, rope, a ski mask, and other tools that had no innocent explanation when combined together. None of these items were illegal by themselves, but in context, they painted a disturbing picture. Bundy was arrested on suspicion of kidnapping. Even then, the full truth remained hidden. During questioning, he stayed composed. He did not panic. He did not confess. Instead, he relied on the same tactics he had always used: confidence, intelligence, and manipulation. He presented himself as misunderstood. He suggested innocent explanations. He leaned into his clean-cut appearance and educational background. At that stage, authorities could not connect him definitively to multiple murders. The evidence was still largely circumstantial. He was charged initially with aggravated kidnapping, not homicide. To many observers, he still looked like a young law student caught in a strange misunderstanding. But investigators were beginning to see cracks in the mask. Witnesses were brought in. Lineups were conducted. Slowly, connections formed. Survivors identified him. Patterns strengthened. The image of the charming student began to shift into something far darker. For the first time since his crimes began, Ted Bundy was behind bars. Yet even in custody, he believed he was in control. And in his mind, this was only a temporary setback. By the time Ted Bundy was transferred to Colorado, investigators were beginning to understand the scale of the threat he posed. Evidence was mounting. Witnesses were identifying him. The image of a harmless law student had started to collapse. Yet despite the seriousness of the accusations, Bundy was still treated differently from most violent offenders. He represented himself in court at times. He appeared articulate and composed. Because of his legal knowledge and calm behavior, authorities granted him limited freedoms to review case files and prepare his defense. He was allowed supervised access to the courthouse library. Officials believed he was intelligent, but they underestimated how determined and dangerous he truly was. That miscalculation would soon shock the nation. On June 7, 1977, Bundy was taken to the courthouse library in Aspen. The room was quiet, lined with shelves of legal books. A deputy remained nearby, but security was relaxed. Bundy had earned a degree of trust through months of compliant behavior. He had studied the layout. He had observed the routines. He had waited patiently. At the right moment, he made his move. Bundy stepped toward a window, opened it, and jumped from the second floor. He landed hard but managed to stand. Within seconds, he was running toward the nearby mountains. A man accused of multiple violent crimes had just escaped custody in broad daylight. For 6 days, he hid in the rugged wilderness outside Aspen. He broke into cabins searching for food and clothing. He lost weight and grew exhausted, but he continued moving, convinced he could outlast the search teams. The story dominated headlines. How could a high-profile suspect simply leap out of a courthouse window and vanish? Eventually, hunger and fatigue slowed him down. A police patrol spotted him near town, disoriented and dirty. He was captured and returned to jail. The public assumed the system would tighten security. But Bundy was already planning again. Back behind bars in Colorado, he appeared defeated. He lost weight noticeably, claiming stress and anxiety were affecting his appetite. Guards saw a thinner, quieter inmate. What they did not realize was that his weight loss was intentional. He was preparing his body for something specific. Inside his small jail cell, Bundy began working on the ceiling. Over time, using simple tools and extraordinary patience, he scraped away at a small opening around a light fixture. Each day, he concealed the damage carefully. Each night, He widened the space just enough. It was a slow process that required discipline and precision. Weeks passed. On the night of December 30th, 1977, Bundy put his plan into action. After evening head count, he stacked books and climbed onto his bed. He removed the light fixture and squeezed his now thinner body through the narrow hole in the ceiling. He crawled into the dark crawl space above the cell block. From there, he navigated the tight space carefully, eventually finding an opening that led into the jail's apartment area, where the sheriff lived. The sheriff was out for the evening. Bundy quietly entered the living quarters, changed into civilian clothing, and walked calmly out the front door. There were no alarms, no immediate pursuit. By the time authorities realized he was gone, hours had passed. For the second time in 1 year, Ted Bundy had escaped custody. But this time was different. This time, he had a significant head start. He boarded flights. He traveled across states. He avoided detection by using stolen identification and keeping a low profile. The man once confined to a jail cell had vanished completely. The story stunned America. How could someone accused of such brutal crimes manipulate the system so effectively? Questions were raised about security failures, procedural mistakes, and misplaced trust. But while officials searched desperately, Bundy was already heading toward his next destination. And this time, the consequences would be even more devastating. After his second escape from custody, Ted Bundy knew he could never return to the life he once pretended to live. His face was now known. His name was spreading across the country. Law enforcement agencies were searching relentlessly. But Bundy was experienced in deception. He understood how to disappear. He fled across state lines and eventually arrived in Florida, hundreds of miles away from the authorities who were hunting him. There, he adopted a false identity and began living under the name Chris Hagen. He rented a small room, kept to himself, and avoided drawing attention. To strangers, he was just another quiet man trying to survive. But beneath the surface, nothing had changed. Bundy had always been driven by impulses he struggled to control. Escape had not ended his violence. It had only delayed it. For a short time, he remained still. He watched. He observed. He studied his surroundings carefully, just as he had done before his earlier crimes. He walked through neighborhoods, visited public spaces, and learned routines. His patience returned, but so did his urges. On the night of January 15th, 1978, Bundy approached the campus of Florida State University in Tallahassee. The campus was quiet. Students were asleep. The world felt safe and calm. No one knew that one of the most dangerous fugitives in America was walking among them. Bundy moved toward the Chi Omega sorority house. Inside, several young women were asleep in their rooms after a normal evening of studying and socializing. The house was peaceful, filled with the quiet stillness of early morning. Bundy entered silently. He moved through the dark hallway like a shadow, careful and deliberate. His actions were quick. Within minutes, lives were forever changed. Chaos replaced peace. Fear replaced safety. The quiet building became a scene of unimaginable horror. But something was different this time. Bundy was no longer the careful, controlled predator he once was. He was tired. He was desperate. He was under pressure. And pressure leads to mistakes. Witnesses saw movement. Someone noticed a strange man leaving the building. Details were vague, but they existed. Physical evidence was left behind. For the first time, Bundy's invisibility was beginning to fade. The predator who had operated in silence was now leaving traces. Authorities responded immediately. The investigation intensified. Police knew they were close to something significant. They just didn't know how close. Bundy fled again, attempting to outrun the consequences of his actions. But the walls were closing in. His luck, which had protected him for so long, was beginning to run out. On February 15th, 1978, just 1 month after the sorority house attack, Bundy was driving through Tallahassee late at night. A police officer noticed the vehicle. Something about it raised suspicion. The car had been reported stolen. The officer initiated a traffic stop. Bundy refused to cooperate. He resisted arrest, fighting desperately to escape. But this time, there was nowhere to run. No mountains. No ceiling to crawl through. No window to jump from. He was overpowered and taken into custody. This arrest was different from the others. This time, investigators had more evidence. They had witnesses. They had physical proof. They had connections linking Bundy to crimes across multiple states. Slowly, Piece by piece, the truth emerged. The charming law student, the polite stranger, the man who once volunteered for political campaigns and worked in crisis centers. It had all been a mask. Behind it was someone capable of unimaginable violence. The trial of Ted Bundy was unlike anything the United States had seen before. It became a national spectacle, drawing media attention from across the country. Every day, millions of people tuned in to watch court proceedings unfold, fascinated and horrified at the story of a man who had committed atrocities beyond comprehension. Bundy's calm demeanor made the events even more chilling. He did not appear like a monster. He looked intelligent, polite, even human. And that was what made his crimes so terrifying, the stark contrast between appearance and reality. Inside the courtroom, Bundy maintained the same charm he had used to manipulate his victims. He smiled occasionally, answered questions with precision, and argued with confidence. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. Witnesses recounted horrifying details of abductions, assaults, and murders. Survivor testimonies added credibility to the accusations. Physical evidence, everything from fibers and fingerprints to objects stolen from victims, painted a picture of meticulous planning and relentless cruelty. Every case tied him more securely to the long string of unsolved disappearances and brutal murders. Despite his attempts to manipulate the proceedings, the jury saw through the mask. The court was filled with tension as the public watched the proceedings with a mixture of fear, fascination, and disbelief. People struggled to comprehend how a man who seemed so normal could commit acts so monstrous. The contrast between his appearance and his actions was stark, and it made the story unforgettable. In the end, the verdict was unanimous. Bundy was found guilty of multiple counts of murder and kidnapping. The courtroom erupted with the weight of the decision, and the sentence was clear: death. For the first time, the monster was no longer free to manipulate, no longer able to hide behind charm or intelligence. Even as the sentence was delivered, Bundy remained calculating. He gave partial confessions, admitting to some of his crimes while withholding many details. Investigators believed the actual number of victims was much higher than he revealed. His desire to control the narrative even in captivity and in court showed how deeply his manipulative tendencies ran. He tried to maintain power until the very end, using information as a weapon. On January 24, 1989, the sentence was carried out. Bundy was executed, and with his death, a chapter of terror in American criminal history came to a close. The execution itself drew attention, though many were left to reflect on the damage he had done and the lives he had destroyed. Remember, the world is not always as it seems. Sometimes the danger is not lurking in darkness, but standing right beside you. Bundy's life and crimes taught America a lesson in vigilance, awareness, and the enduring human struggle to comprehend the darkest sides of human nature. And for Colleen Stan, for Bundy's victims, and for the nation, justice, though delayed, finally came. So, like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more stories on Me Time Story, where we uncover the most shocking, real-life cases that will leave you questioning what you thought you knew about safety, trust, and the human mind.